If your quest for longevity feels overwhelming, here's some good news. It starts with one simple daily habit. MitoPure gummies from Timeline. They're the first ever longevity gummies that ignite mitophagy, your body's natural anti-aging pathway. MitoPure is a clinically validated solution backed by over 15 years of research. MitoPure gummies utilize a powerful compound that redefines what's possible for your longevity. MitoPure produces the first ever urolithin A gummies that support your cellular energy so you feel strong, clear, and vibrant. Boost your cellular energy and enhance muscle strength and endurance, all without changing your diet or exercise routine. As someone who loves to stay active, I've noticed a significant boost in my workouts since I started using it. I feel stronger and more energized, and my recovery time has improved dramatically. Better recovery starts at the cellular level. For more information and to order, just go to timeline.com/Hoffman. Use coupon code Hoffman at checkout for 20% off. That's timeline.com/Hoffman for 20% off MitoPure gummies with code Hoffman. Welcome to today's Intelligent Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Ronald Hoffman. Today we're going to talk about a very, very important aspect of nutrition. You know, so often we hear that sugar is harmful for you, but when it comes to ditching sugar, getting rid of it from your diet, well, there are a few practical suggestions on how to go about it. Today we're going to talk to an expert. She is a research neuroscientist, author, and expert in the fields of nutrition, diet, and addiction, Dr. Nicole Avena. She received a PhD in neuroscience and psychology from Princeton University, which, by the way, that's really the intersection that we need to look at. Yes, it is to some extent psychological, but it's also physiological. We have to look at the actual structure of the brain and how the nervous system links to hormonal systems in the body. And Dr. Avena did her postdoctoral fellowship in molecular biology at the Rockefeller University. So, Dr. Avena, can I download your brain, please? Because I just took some passing courses in molecular biology. It was a requirement in med school. But, getting a PhD, okay, that's another story entirely. So, so she's written a great book. It's called Sugarless, the 7-Step Plan, and it's called the sugar. Wait, it is. I'm looking at something that says something about Dr. Johnson, but that's not you. Yours is Sugarless. The book is called Sugarless. And what's the subtitle of the book, please?
It's the 7-Step Plan to uncover hidden sugars, curb your cravings, and conquer your addiction.
Okay, great. So give us an idea of the scope of the problem. How pervasive is the problem? And why should we be concerned about sugar in our diets? You know, it's something that has been a part of our heritage as long as Paleolithic man scaled cliffs and endured bee stings in order to raid a beehive. I mean, there's a powerful drive for sugar, isn't there? It's inbuilt.
It's true. It's true. We have this innate biological desire for things that are sweet because traditionally in the history of mankind, things that were sweet were good for us. So, our ancestors who were braving the bees to get that honey, it has antifungal, antimicrobial properties in addition to, tasting sweet. But what's happened, especially over the past 50 years or so, is we've seen a complete shift in our food environment. And now the majority of the foods that we eat are highly processed foods that are basically engineered in food laboratories. And they contain a lot of different ingredients that we're now learning are perhaps not good for our health in excess. And sugar is one of them. And when we look at all of the food products that are out there, 80% of the processed foods in the grocery store are going to contain added sugar. And we know it's bad for our health in many different ways, not just about physical health in terms of, gaining too much weight or contributing to diabetes, but also mental health. And we're finding that, more and more of the changes in our brain that happen later in life are actually being linked back to, some of the things that sugar can do in our bodies when we're younger.
Well, talk to us a little bit about the history of sugar consumption in the world, because I've done a little bit of a survey of that, and it turns out that many civilizations prized sugar, but it wasn't until the modern industrial era and the advent of sugar cultivation, first with sugar cane, then with sugar beets, and finally with the most ubiquitous form of sugar that we now find in the human diet, which is high fructose corn syrup, that we've seen a tremendous uptick in our consumption of calories from sugar. So can you speak to what these different developments have meant?
Yeah, it's really an interesting history when you look at sugar. So, back in like the Victorian era, for example, sugar was something that was, seen as a gift that you would maybe have a sweet treat around the holidays, a few times a year. It was something that people really relished in when they were to get access to it because there wasn't a lot of it, right? And again, we have this sort of biological drive to think if it's sweet, it's good for us. And so when you only have even refined sugar a couple times a year, yeah, it's probably not necessarily bad for you. But what we've seen happen is that with the industrialization of our food supply, with the ways in which we've been able to develop technologies to create these different ingredients and to mass produce the amount of sugar that we have access to, we've seen that it has essentially infiltrated our food supply. And there's a few reasons behind that. One is it's cheap. Over time, we've been able to make sugar a lot more affordable. It's been able to be a commodity that's come down in price. And like you mentioned with high fructose corn syrup, especially we can, use corn to develop this particular sugar. And so we've been able to create this ingredient that we can mass produce and put into lots of different things for relatively little money compared to what it used to be. And, with that, people like the food better, right? If it tastes sweet, people like it. And so we've had this sort of slow walk into our diet being sweeter and sweeter and sweeter over time. And now we're at the point where I think we're at the point of no return, to be quite honest, in the sense that now we have a complete saturation of our diet with added sugars. And unfortunately, on top of that, we're seeing that what was once positioned to be the solution, which was artificial sweeteners or these, alternative sweeteners, now we're seeing not only are food companies adding sugar, but they're also adding all of these other sweeteners to the same products as well. So the sweetness just continues to rise as time goes on.
Is there something particularly pernicious about high fructose corn syrup? Because some allege that good old-fashioned sucrose, which is table sugar, a disaccharide, is in some ways is bad because it's caloric and it does challenge the metabolism of the body to handle it, insulin and so on. But there's something particularly bad about high fructose corn syrup.
Well, I wouldn't say that either of them are particularly good, for sure. The big difference between the two, and we've published research studies looking at this, is like you said, sucrose, which is, the typical table sugar, is a disaccharide. It is a combination of two sugars, one being fructose, that is bound with a molecule. It's molecularly bound 50-50. Now, high fructose corn syrup is different in the sense that most formulations, at least, of high fructose corn syrup claim that it's 55% fructose compared to the 50% fructose that you would find in sucrose. It's also unbound, meaning that there isn't that bond holding the sugar molecules together. But what's happened is that studies have shown that many formulations are not 55% fructose. In fact, they're much, much greater. And you mentioned Dr. Johnson a few minutes ago. He provided one of the endorsements for my book, but he's done quite a lot of work and done some really cool studies looking exactly at that question about, how much fructose is actually in this high fructose corn syrup. And, there's different formulations of high fructose corn syrup. Some of them have a higher fructose content that's meant for baking purposes or certain types of culinary reasons. But the traditional stuff that we would find in our beverages or everyday food products isn't always 55%. Now, the question is, so who cares, right? Well, the thing is, fructose, when we consume it in excess, and I'm not talking about eating too many strawberries or apples. I'm talking about when it's
a
highly
natural fruit
concentrated.
sugar. It's a natural constituent of fruit. So, perhaps moderation in fruit consumption, that might be okay, unless one is striving to be on an ultra low carb diet. But you really amp it up when you artificially make this concoction, this high fructose corn syrup, right?
Absolutely. You would have to sit there for days and days and days eating apples to get the amount of fructose out of apples that you're going to be getting out of some of these formulations of high fructose corn syrup. The things that is dangerous about this is that when you consume fructose in excess, it can cause fat to bind to our liver. And so you may have heard of, fatty liver disease, right? This is something that 30 years ago, you'd only see in people who were really alcoholics. Whereas now we actually had to create a new category of the condition known as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease to explain why so many kids are getting it. Because, you got 11, 12-year-old kids walking around with fatty livers. It's not because they're drinking alcohol. It's because they're consuming excess amounts of sugars. And the fructose is causing the fat to bind to their liver, which is definitely not good to be happening at such a young age.
Indeed. So, what are some of the consequences that we see in epidemiology, looking at various disease states that might be attributable to our infatuation with sugar?
Well, when I first started doing research on this topic, I was interested in the obesity crisis. And, when I first started this work, I was a grad student back at Princeton, and it was the year 2001. And back then we were really just starting to, in the media and in public health, talk a lot about this rise in obesity rates that was happening. And it was something that at the time, people were still of the mindset that, well, if you're overweight or obese, it's your fault. It's because you don't have the willpower and the self-control and the discipline to control yourself around food. And, I started thinking about this and I thought, well, a lot goes into making decisions about your health. But one of the things that's really curious about this particular issue is that so many people are getting overweight or obese, and there's tons of information out there to help them. There's tons of diet programs, there's tons of plans, recipes, all that stuff is available, but people find it really hard to stick to the plan, even when it's laid out very clearly for them. And so we started to think, well, maybe it's not the people, maybe it's the food. Maybe there's something about the types of foods that people are eating and all the added sugar that's being added to these processed foods that could be getting people hooked on them in ways like people can get addicted to drugs or alcohol. And so we started looking at this from the standpoint of trying to understand obesity and the development of being overweight. And that's certainly one condition that, sugar seems to play a role in, but there's a lot of others, and lots of research has come out since then pointing to the fact that, sugar can contribute to cardiovascular disease. I mean, we were really told mostly through the 1990s to avoid fat if we wanted to avoid cardiovascular disease, and to avoid salt if we want to avoid cardiovascular disease. But it turns out sugar is just as bad, if not worse, at promoting cardiovascular disease. Also, there's been a lot of work recently that I find really interesting, looking at the role of excess sugar intake throughout the lifespan and the development of Alzheimer's disease and dementia later in life. And although the mechanisms aren't quite exactly worked out yet, it does seem to be involving insulin signaling in the brain, and how if you have a diet that's very rich in sugars for the better part of your life, it can alter your brain's insulin signaling and receptor in a way that may be promoting dementia later on. So there are quite a few conditions that certainly are affected by sugar. And I think as time goes on and more people in different disciplines are studying this, we're going to learn about a whole lot more that are affected by it, in addition to the ones I just described.
Okay, folks, at this point, let's pause and allow one of our sponsors this opportunity to share an important message.
Kids don't just bring home homework, they bring home germs. And those germs don't just stay with them, they spread to the whole household. That's why Clear Nasal Spray was created by a practicing physician to give parents and grandparents peace of mind. You may not think about it, but your nose is filtering out a semi-truck full of air every single day. Clear isn't just another spray. It creates an additional layer of protection in your nose that blocks bacteria and viruses before they can even take hold. Yes, even that virus. Supporting your body's defenses right where germs first try to enter. Clear is a hygiene product recommended for daily use, drug-free, non-drowsy, and safe for all ages. Just a quick spray in the morning and evening helps you cleanse your nose. Don't just hope for protection, create it. Get Clear Nasal Spray, your daily defense. Clear Nasal Spray is available at retailers nationwide and online. Check out Xlear.com for our special offers. That's Xlear.com.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for supporting our sponsors. They are what make intelligent medicine a continuing free resource to you. And now back to our guest, Dr. Nicole Avena. So your initial orientation was in neuroscience and psychology, not so much endocrinology or the study of obesity, but you are a student of the brain. And so your research and the research of others, your colleagues, has demonstrated that excess sugar consumption can in effect rewire the brain and kind of be a self-perpetuating vicious cycle.
It's true. And we've done quite a few studies looking at the brain. One of our initial studies actually was to really just ask this very basic question of what does sugar do to the dopamine reward system? And it was an important question because the hallmark of drugs of abuse is that every time you take a hit of a drug of abuse, whether it's nicotine, morphine, heroin, you name it, it releases dopamine in the reward-related regions of the brain. That's why people, feel that high and feel the pleasure that they get when they use a drug for that first time. And food doesn't do that. Normally, when you eat food, it doesn't produce an increase in dopamine. It does a lot of other things in the brain and different parts of the brain, but it doesn't typically result in this dopamine spike. And so the question we really had was, okay, well, what's going to happen with sugar if you consume a large amount of sugar, if you binge on sugar, which, let's face it, if you eat a granola bar, you're binging on sugar because there's so much sugar in that granola bar in proportion to, the rest of the ingredients.
It has sort of a health halo because it's whole grains, natural, blah, blah, blah. But it's a big hit of sugar. It's sweetened.
Exactly. And that's, one of the things about binging, we typically think, if you're binging on something, you need to have this large volume of it. Well, yeah, you can have a large volume of sugar in a very small vessel in the form of a granola bar or a candy bar. So when we did these experiments, we found that indeed sugar was able to release dopamine just like a drug would. And it wasn't just dopamine. We looked at other neurochemicals. We looked at the receptors for other neurochemicals, including dopamine, the brain endogenous opioids. And we were seeing remarkable similarities in terms of what was happening in response to sugar and what happens in response to drugs. And so this was a real, I think, turning point for the work we were doing because for me, we have, as neuroscientists, we have, our brain studies, but as psychologists, we also have these behavioral studies that we do in tandem. And when we were starting to really see these neurochemical studies validate these behaviors that we were seeing, it really started to set off some bells and whistles for me that we were maybe onto something and that this was worth pursuing. And that's, really why even now to this day, we're still doing experiments in this area because there's just so many questions that we've been able to answer, but there's also a lot of questions that, we've been able to ask as a result.
Well, since dopamine is really the neurotransmitter of reinforcement, building habits, and ultimately addictions, does that kind of portend a kind of a gloomy picture for people who early on have a lot of sugar exposure? Sometimes I think that the way to address our sugar epidemic is to start early with kids. But once kids have been wired to crave sugar, either in utero, even preconceptually, or even prenatally, or in the early years of life, is that a point of no return? Because the brain literally has been rewired to accept this as part of a program of reinforcement.
A really great question. And we wondered this ourselves empirically. And so when we were doing some of our initial studies looking at how sugar affects the brain in adults, we wondered, well, what would happen during pregnancy? And so at the time, we were doing our studies in our little lab rats, and we were giving them either sugar, sucrose, or we were giving them high fructose corn syrup during pregnancy, and then watching the effects that would happen with the offspring in terms of their food preferences, their sensitivity to drugs and alcohol, and different things like that. And we found some really interesting things in rats that never have tasted sugar. They were just exposed to it in utero.
Wow.
We were able to see alterations in their preference for sugar. We were able to see elevated triglyceride levels. They're not even eating sugar or anything abnormal. It's just that something's happening in utero to change the way in which their body is metabolizing or processing triglycerides. And we were also able to see that they were more likely to become overweight, even when eating a normal calorie diet. They also were more sensitive to drugs and alcohol. So if they had a choice to drink alcohol or to, be administered a drug of abuse, they would show a heightened responsivity to it if they'd just been exposed to sugar in the womb.
So the suggestion is that it sort of kindles the addictive center in the brain, even in prenatal development, so that the significant morphological and functional changes in the brain can occur as early as in utero, and certainly in infancy and early childhood.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we have been able to see this in the research lab. There's been other laboratories throughout the US that have published studies, showing changes in, DNA methylation for dopamine, for example, in these reward related regions, just in response to the maternal diet. So to answer your question about, is it too late? Because again, it does paint somewhat of a bleak picture in the sense that, if you can't control what your mom ate when she was pregnant with you, and you really can't control what you were fed up until, you pretty much left your house when you're 18. But it does mean that we have created a more difficult situation in the sense that many, many people are entering adulthood, or being born at least, primed to be dependent on sugar. And then when sugar is all over our food environment and it's being socially accepted and, really just no restrictions on it in terms of how we view it, then that really does set people up for problems in terms of controlling their intake. Now it's certainly possible to change. Obviously, our brains are malleable. They're always changing. But I think that we're finding that so many people are struggling, and we're seeing so many cases, especially of young people, developing type 2 diabetes at an early age, developing fatty liver disease, getting metabolic syndrome, because they were born genetically primed and now into an environment that's promoting this type of intake.
And we often talk about a toxic food environment, because when you want to abstain from alcohol, you simply don't go into a bar. If you want to abstain from drug use, well, maybe you don't hang around on the street corner where the dealer is going to be offering free samples. But you got to eat. You got to go into a supermarket. The areas where junk food are sold are not segregated from the fresh fruits and vegetables and natural meats and proteins. These temptations are ubiquitous. So should we take a kind of an addiction model with this? Because, we know that the Sacklers went into disrepute when they started to purvey a drug called OxyContin. And they said, well, it's great for pain, but don't worry about it. It's not addictive. But at some level, maybe we should use this addiction model and this issue of causing public harm to take to the food manufacturers and say, hey, wait a minute, you are causing mayhem, and you're actually offering a disease-causing product, just like the tobacco industry did.
Right. And I think the thing that we think about moving forward with sugar is that, sugar, I believe, truly is addictive. I think there's a significant amount of research, and it's not just mine. There's tons of other researchers who've been looking at this and have published papers that support our findings. If we have something that's addictive, but we also have something that's toxic, that is a public health concern. I mean, okay, so caffeine, for example.
It kind of really closes the circle on an argument for either regulation or even, tobacco-style litigation, right?
Exactly. I mean, that's where, with tobacco, if it was addictive and it's toxic, then it's a problem, right? And, something like caffeine, for example, yeah, I know plenty of people, including myself, who would be considered addicted to coffee. I like it every day. I have it a couple times a day, but it's not toxic in the sense that, it's causing me or others harm. With sugar, we now know that not only is it addictive, but it's also toxic in the sense that it's linked to all of these health conditions. It's producing fatty liver disease in some people. And we know that it's physically harming our bodies and our brains. And so I think that's where, moving forward, we will be having to make the arguments, because if it is something that people, the food industry likes to say, oh, well, just have it in moderation. And,
right.
We never told you to eat the whole box
right.
of cookies.
They also say that it is accompanied by an active lifestyle. You can mitigate the harm from the sugar. So basically, drink a Coke, and do a spin class, and you'll obviate the harm of the substance.
Right. That's a lot of spin classes for most people, right?
It's a lot of spin is from the food industry too.
It is. It really is. But it's true. I think that has sort of been the argument that, if you're going to enjoy these foods, enjoy them in moderation,
right.
Or like you said, enjoy them, with a healthy exercise routine. But, you could not exercise your way out of the standard American diet if you tried to. I mean, there's no way. There's not enough time in the gym, not enough ways in which you could burn those calories. I mean, I ran 5 miles today and I burned 500 calories, and I could eat, a sandwich that has 500 calories probably in 3 minutes. And it took me 45 minutes to run those 5 miles. So just the time exchange alone, I mean, the amount of calories that we can consume happens much more quickly than the amount of how long it takes us to burn it off. So that's where we are now. I think moving forward, it's really going to be about the fact that, if these things are addictive and they're containing ingredients that are addictive, how can you tell people to just have only a little bit? And how can we continue to sell them in the ways that we have and the amounts that we have?
Okay, so much for bad news. Your book, entitled Sugarless, outlines a 7-step plan for addressing probably the most pervasive problem in America, which is sugar addiction. I virtually can't, perhaps there are some outliers, but I can't think of anyone who's not at one point or another prey to this ravaging epidemic. So when we return, we're going to talk a little bit about a 7-step plan, some practical measures that people can undertake to wean themselves off of sugar. By the way, your book was released in timely fashion in December. That's when, people start making resolutions. It's a little late in the year, in the cycle, because people probably abandoned many of their resolutions. But hey, it's springtime. It's Lent. It's a time of renewal. And so it's a good topic to discuss at this point. Let's pause, and when we return, we'll talk about some practical measures that people can undertake to wean themselves off the white stuff. I'm Dr. Ronald Hoffman. Our guest is Dr. Avina. She is Dr. Nicole Avina is a research neuroscientist, author, and expert in the fields of nutrition, diet, and addiction. We'll be right back with more of today's Intelligent Medicine Podcast.